Hello, welcome to my animated video theory series. Today we'll be talking about reader response criticism and some of its major points and major aspects. First of all, historical background. It has classical roots. Both Plato and Aristotle were aware of the effects of works of literature. Plato, in fact, worried that poets would stir up the emotions of the audience. He also believed that art, as a copy of a copy, was at a furthest remove from truth and therefore misled people. In his Republic, he excludes poets from his ideal society. Aristotle, the first formalist, was also conscious of the significance of specific rhetorical effects of works of art. In his discussion of tragic form found in the Poetics, he tells us that tragic plays elicit from spectators the feeling of pity and fear. Furthermore, another portion of his descriptive analysis of tragic form refers to proper magnitude in plays. This probably meant that dramatists must not overload the audience with complicated plots or excess information. Do keep in mind that he sees the audience as passive. Now, the second part of historical background, reader response criticism in the 20th century. As we have learned, new criticism exerted a powerful influence upon the way critics read literature and teachers taught literature well into the 1960s. Especially in America and Britain, you were not taken seriously as a reader or critic if you did not espouse the tenets of new criticism. In the midst of this hegemony of new criticism, Louise Rosenblatt proposed a different model for literary analysis. In Literature as Exploration, she proposed her transactional theory, in which she saw reading as a transaction between reader and text. Meaning is as dependent upon the reader as it is dependent upon the text. There is no universal, absolute interpretation of a poem. Rather, there can be several probable interpretations depending in part upon what the reader brings to the text. For Rosenblatt, the reader is not passive. Rosenblatt, by the way, agreed with new critics' emphasis upon close reading. Reading is a transaction in which readers, while bringing their world of experience to activate the text, respect the text on its own terms. Types of reader response critics. 1. Rhetorical criticism analyzes texts in terms of rhetorical strategies embedded to influence readers. These critics, for example, might see plot as an arrangement of certain effects, moving us to first question events, giving us partial teasing answers, deliberately delaying discovery of information, surprising us with new information or reversal of expectations, and so on. This approach assumes that the text exerts more control over the interpretive process than the reader. Structuralist criticism, on the other hand, describes the codes readers acquire and use to ascertain meaning. Since codes change across the time, interpretations vary. Keep in mind, in rhetorical criticism, then, the text guides the reader. In the structuralist criticism, the reader brings the codes that he and she has internalized and then applies them to the text. So these are the first two types of reader response criticism. Then are the phenomenologists, studies how the mind processes text. Hans Robert Joss, a reception theorist, studies how horizons of expectation change with time, thereby changing the way audiences interpret text. Wolfgang Iser analyzed the text effect on both the implied reader and the actual reader. Iser's implied reader is the reader implied by the text, the hypothetical reader predisposed to appreciate the effects of the text. In other words, what sort of reader does this text seem to address? How informed about the nuances of words, history, conventions, strategies of irony, etc. In experimental modernist texts, we might ask, what kind of reader does this challenging text attempt to create? A question a rhetorical critic might as well ask. Iser also discusses ways in which texts are concretized in the mind. He will discuss ways in which texts call upon and alter the reader's own horizon of expectations. How, in other words, does a novel set us up to expect something only to deliver something else? Easer also discusses gaps in the text, places in which the text expects us to fill in information or otherwise use our imagination. From all this, it is clear that we have come a long way from Aristotle's view of a passive audience. For Easer, readers create the text, filling in gaps, anticipating what is to come, all along using their own for understanding, to process the work. Sometimes the text subverts that pre-understanding, creating disturbing effects. Sometimes it confirms it. So we are into the act of reader actively reading a text, but it is still an informed reader. And then we get to the subjective reader response criticism. Here, the text is subordinated to the individual reader. The subject becomes the individual reader as he reveals himself in the act of reading. For example, imagine a reader outraged by a story in which a father ignores his child. The intensity of the reader's reaction may lie in his or her conflicted relationship with his or her father. This kind of criticism has been attacked as too relativistic and of limited usefulness in the classroom. Defenders of this approach point out that literature must work on a personal, emotional level to move us powerfully. Stephen Melou urges that students be allowed their personal, powerful reaction, but then expect to make his response relative to an interpretive community. Now, this is what most of us think when we are not trained what reader response criticism is. Assumptions. Meaning is equal to the text plus the reader, right? The text read by a reader constitutes the meaning of the text. So the reader has now become an integral part of the meaning-making process. Hence, reader response criticism. And that's crucial to keep in mind. Even though text would sometimes guide its own expectations, but meaning is text plus the reader. And that is one of the crucial assumptions of reader response criticism. Now, methodology is complicated. It varies with each of the types that I previously discussed. In general, the reader response critic looks to way in which a literary text affects the reader intellectually and affectively. Close reading is still important. In this case, the critic looks carefully at how the text stimulates the work of the reader, right? So how does the text emotionally and intellectually impact the reader? And then what does the reader do with that? That would be the method depending on which school you're following. Now, all of this information has come from this one source. The link is up there. I'm grateful to them, and you can also further explore it. As always, thank you for watching. And as I always say at the end of my conversations, peace and love.